He didn't take her to a warehouse. He took her to the 40th floor. The Penthouse occupied the entire top of Ashford Holdings' flagship building in Chicago's West Loop, and it was, objectively speaking, the most beautiful prison Hazel had ever seen. Floor-to-ceiling glass wrapped the entire south wall, overlooking the city's skyline bleeding into the grey November afternoon. The furniture was clean-lined and expensive, pale marble, dark steel, leather the colour of good coffee. There was a kitchen stocked like a restaurant, and a bathroom with a rainfall shower and heated floors. There was also no elevator access without Ashford's biometric key. Hazel stood in the center of the open living space, her laptop bag still strapped across her shoulder, her coat still buttoned. She had been up here for exactly 11 minutes. She had spent 9 of them cataloging exits. There were none she could reasonably use without a base jump, and the remaining 2 memorizing the layout of the room. Then she pulled out her laptop and sat down at the dining table, because there was nothing else useful to do, and she had 400 pages of audit documents she hadn't finished reconciling. When Ashford walked back in 20 minutes later, he stopped in the doorway. She didn't look up. "You're working," he said. It wasn't a question. It was the tone of a man who had expected something, crying, maybe, or bargaining, and had received a spreadsheet instead. "You have a $2.3 million discrepancy in your Q3 port logistics invoices," Hazel said, scrolling. "I was going to include it in the official report, but since that's apparently not happening, I figured I'd at least understand it before you decide what to do with me." Silence. She looked up then, because the silence had a particular quality. Not dangerous, not furious, just stunned. Silas Ashford was 41 years old, built like a man who had survived things that should have killed him, and dressed in a charcoal suit that cost more than Hazel's monthly rent. He had the kind of face that had been handsome once and was now just severe, a jaw that looked carved from something stubborn, dark eyes that took everything in and gave nothing back. There was a scar along the left side of his neck, pale and old and clearly not from a surgery. He was staring at her like she was a species of animal he hadn't encountered before. "The discrepancy," Hazel continued, turning her screen to face him, "traces back to a shell invoice from a company called Meridian Transit LLC, which doesn't exist. Someone created it in your system 8 months ago and has been routing payments through it ever since." She paused. "That's not me finding your second set of books, by the way. That's me finding someone stealing from you while you weren't looking." Ashford crossed the room in 4 long strides. He stopped at the edge of the table, looked at the screen. The muscle in his jaw moved once. "Meridian," he said quietly. "You know it." "I thought I did." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, not lounging, not territorial. Just sat the way a man sits when something has rearranged his understanding of a situation. "That account was authorized by my operations director, a man I've known for 12 years. Hazel looked at him, his name Taff. Ashford went very still. "How do you know that?" "Because his authorization signature is on 6 of the 7 Meridian invoices. The 7th was signed by someone using his login credentials at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, which means either Taft was working late or someone who knows his password was covering their tracks." She turned the screen back toward herself. "Either way, it's his problem, or yours, depending on how you look at it." For a long moment, Ashford just looked at her. The afternoon light came through the glass at a low angle and caught the silver at his temples, and Hazel became suddenly, acutely aware that she was alone in a locked penthouse with a man who ran a criminal syndicate and had 40 minutes ago told her calmly that the 2 men who'd been following her since Wednesday were his, and that they had been the only reason she was still alive. "Are you afraid of me?" Ashford asked. Hazel considered this with the same honest attention she gave to numbers. "Not yet," she said. "Ask me again after you decide what you're going to do about the $2.3 million. Something shifted in his face. It wasn't quite a smile. It was the ghost of one, gone before it could fully form. "I haven't decided anything," he said, "about you." "I know." She closed the laptop. "That's why I'm still here." She found out about the coffee situation on the second morning. The kitchen was stocked with a single-origin Ethiopian blend that Ashford apparently had imported directly from a farm she'd never heard of, and there was a machine that required a manual calibration process before each use, and there were approximately 14 steps between her and a functional cup of coffee. She was on step 7, referencing the handwritten instruction card someone had taped to the inside of the cabinet door when Ashford appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was already in a suit, which meant he had been awake for hours. There were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there the day before. He watched her for a moment. The grind setting is the dial on the left, not the right. "I figured that out," Hazel said, after the first attempt. "You could have asked." "You weren't here." She watched the machine run through its cycle. "Where do you go in the mornings?" "Floors 20 through 38. I have a building to run." He moved to the opposite counter, poured himself a cup from a second machine, smaller, simpler, already brewed, and leaned back against the counter. "The legitimate one." "The legitimate one," Hazel repeated. In the same flat tone he'd used, she accepted the cup her machine finally produced and took a sip. It was, despite everything, excellent. "I need my charger. For my laptop. I left it in my audit bag at the office on Friday and I'm running on 30%. Ashford looked at her over his cup. "I'll have someone retrieve it." "And my notebook. The physical one, black cover. It has handwritten reconciliation notes in it that aren't in the digital files." "Anything else?" "Not right now." She sat down at the dining table, which had become by default her workstation. "But I'll let you know." He stood there a moment longer than necessary. She had the impression this happened to him rarely. Being in a room with someone who was not afraid of him, not performing for him, not calculating how to use him, just drinking his coffee and asking for a charger. "Why aren't you trying to leave?" he asked. Hazel set her cup down. She had grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Gary, Indiana, with her mother and her mother's rotating cast of bad decisions. She had put herself through community college on a Pell Grant and a night shift at a diner. And she had taught herself forensic accounting from library books, because she was good at finding where money went when someone wanted it to disappear. She had spent 8 years being the least important person in every room she walked into. She was very good at reading a situation. "Because the 2 options you gave me in the lobby were leave and be dead or come up here," she said, "and you still haven't offered me a 3rd option." She picked up her cup again. "When you do, I'll consider it." Ashford studied her for another long moment. Then he walked out of the kitchen without another word. She heard him on the phone in the hallway. 20 minutes later, a young man she'd never seen before knocked on the penthouse door. Ashford let him in personally and handed her a bag containing her laptop charger, her notebook, and, inexplicably, the granola bar she'd left in her coat pocket. Hazel looked at the granola bar. Then she looked toward the hallway where Ashford had disappeared. She put the granola bar in her laptop bag and went back to work. By the 3rd day, the penthouse had a different rhythm. Ashford worked from the 38th floor until 2 in the afternoon. He came up after that, and they worked at opposite ends of the dining table, him on his encrypted system, her on hers, with the kind of focused silence that's existed between people doing serious work in a shared space. It was not comfortable exactly, but it was not hostile either. It was on the 3rd day that she found the rest of it. Not the shell companies, those she had mapped on day 1. Not the invoice fraud, that was Taft's doing, she was increasingly certain. What she found on the 3rd day was a pattern in the port routing schedules that told her someone on the inside was selling Ashford's shipment windows to a competing operation. She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she looked at Ashford, who was reading something on his screen, with the expression of a man who had not slept properly in several days. "You have another problem," she said. He looked up. In 3 days, she had learned that he did not show surprise easily. But she had also learned the small tells, the fraction of tension that moved through his shoulders, the way his attention sharpened when she said something he hadn't anticipated. "The routing schedules," she said. "Your Lake Michigan corridor, Tuesday and Thursday windows. Someone's been flagging them to an outside party. The pattern started 6 weeks ago, and it correlates perfectly with 3 shipments that got intercepted." She turned her screen toward him. "That's not a coincidence. That's a calendar." Ashford crossed the room. He leaned over her shoulder to look at the screen, and she was suddenly very aware of how close he was. The smell of his suit, wool, and something faintly like cedar, and beneath it the faint exhaustion she'd been watching accumulate over 3 days like sediment at the bottom of a glass. He stared at the data for a long time. "Taft manages the routing schedules," he said. "Yes," Hazel pointed at the screen. "But look at the timestamp on the external flag. It goes out 2 hours before Taft would have even had access. Someone else is in his system, or someone else has access to the raw calendar before it goes through him." Ashford straightened up. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her, looking out at the grey city. She watched his reflection in the glass, the rigid set of his shoulders, the way his hand came up to press against the scar on his neck, a gesture she'd noticed he made when he was working something through. "His assistant," Ashford said quietly. "Taft's assistant has access to the raw scheduling system." "Who is he?" "Someone Taft hired 18 months ago." He turned around. His face was doing something she hadn't seen before. Not anger, not calculation, something rawer than either. "I went to Taft's daughter's wedding." Hazel said nothing. She had learned in 3 days that some things were not about numbers. "Loyalty used to be a fixed cost," Ashford said. "You paid for it once, and it stayed." He looked at her. "I don't know when it started depreciating." "Loyalty's always depreciated," Hazel said. "You just didn't build it into the model." He looked at her for a long, strange moment. "You're very calm for someone in your situation," he said. "I'm very tired for someone in my situation," she corrected. Calm and tired looked the same from the outside. Something crossed his face. Not pity, she didn't want that. Recognition, maybe. The kind that only moved across the face of someone who understood the specific exhaustion of holding everything together through sheer will, and never letting anyone see what it cost. He pulled out the chair next to her and sat down. "Show me," he said, "all of it, from the beginning." They worked until 2 in the morning. She woke at 4 a.m. to the sound of the elevator. Hazel was out of bed before she was fully conscious, her heart hammering in the specific way of someone whose nervous system had spent 4 days in a state of low-grade vigilance. She crossed to the bedroom door and pressed her ear against it. Footsteps, uneven, one heavier than the other. She opened the door. Ashford was in the hallway, one hand braced against the wall. He was still in his suit jacket, but the jacket was dark and wet down one side, clinging to his ribs in a way that took her exactly 1 second to understand. His face was the color of old cement. He turned his head toward her, and his eyes were alert but working very hard to stay that way. "There was a complication," he said. "Sit down," Hazel said. "I'm fine." "You're bleeding through your jacket. Sit down." She got him to the couch. She pulled off his jacket. He let her, which told her more about how bad it was than anything else, and found the source, a long gash along his left side, below the ribs, deep enough to need more than a bandage. It had been partially addressed, wrapped badly in the field, but the wrapping had shifted, and it had been bleeding steadily. "First aid kit," she said. "Hall closet, bottom shelf." "Hold pressure." She put his hand over the wound and went. The kit was a black hard case, military grade, everything organized and labeled. She brought it back, set it on the coffee table, and opened it with the methodical focus of someone who had learned a long time ago that panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Who did this?" she asked, pulling on the nitrile gloves. "Taft's associates." He watched her work through half-closed eyes. They were faster than expected. "How many did you bring?" 3. Griggs is downstairs securing the perimeter. And Taft. The word was flat and final. She didn't ask what that meant. She poured antiseptic over the gash. Ashford went rigid, his jaw clamped shut, his right hand gripping the edge of the couch cushion until his knuckles went white. She worked quickly, cleaning the wound, closing it with butterfly strips, and then, where it was deepest, 3 careful sutures from the kit's pre-threaded, curved needle. She had never sutured a person before. She did it the way she did everything she had never been trained for, by reading the situation, by being methodical, by not allowing her hands to shake until she was done. Ashford watched her face the whole time. She could feel it. "Why aren't you asking me to let you go?" he said when she tied off the last knot. His voice was rough, stripped down by pain and blood loss. "Would you?" She taped gauze over the wound. "No." "Then it's not a productive question." She sat back on her heels and looked at him. He looked terrible. He also looked, for the first time since she had met him, like something other than a man who was entirely in control of his world. He looked like a man who was very tired and very alone, and who had dragged himself to the 41st floor of his own building because there was nowhere else to go. "You have fever starting," she said. "Drink water. Don't sleep on your left side." "You sound like a nurse." "I sound like someone who reads things." She stood and picked up the kit. "The apartment is secured from the inside. Griggs is downstairs. The people who did this, how many of them are still a problem?" "Enough." He leaned his head back against the couch. "The Caruso operation. They've been trying to take the lake corridor for 2 years. Taft gave them the opening. Hazel processed this. Then you need to move before they capitalize on it. How fast can Griggs reorganize your people?" "By morning, if I give the order." "Then give it. I'll lock the offshore routing from up here. Nothing moves without dual authorization until you've verified who's clean." She walked toward the hallway, paused. "Ashford." He opened his eyes. "The elevator code," she said. "What is it?" He looked at her for a long moment. She watched something move through his expression, not suspicion, not cold calculation. Something quieter than either. The exhaustion of a man who has run his entire life as a closed system, finally reaching the bottom of himself. 4712, he said. Hazel memorized it. She walked to the elevator panel and punched in the code. The light blinked green. The doors slid open. The lobby was 40 floors down, and the street was right outside, and she had not been outside in 4 days. She stood at the open elevator and looked at the brass interior and thought about Gary, Indiana, and 8 years of walking into rooms where she was the least important person in them, and the specific, peculiar weight of being the only one who could see exactly where everything was going wrong. She turned around. She walked back to the couch and dropped a blanket over Ashford's legs. "Get some sleep," she said. "I'll have the account locks in place before you wake up." He was already half gone. But she saw his eyes open fractionally, just for a second, and in them was the specific expression of a person who has offered something they expected to lose and found it return to them instead. She went to the dining table and got to work. By 10 in the morning, Griggs had arrived with 2 men Ashford vouched for, and the Penthouse had become a command center. Hazel had not slept. She had reorganized every accessible account in Ashford's operation, locking 14 offshore routes, flagging 6 accounts associated with names from Taft's communications, and drafting a clean cash flow map of the lake corridor that stripped out every transaction Taft's assistant had touched. She had the whole thing documented in a format that was useful to Ashford and completely incomprehensible to anyone who didn't know his system the way she knew it now. Griggs was a wide man with a flat face and the kind of stillness that meant he was always calculating distances. He looked at Hazel. He looked at Ashford, who was sitting upright on the couch, color improved, shirt changed, working through a phone briefing with controlled focus. "This her?" Griggs said. "She handles the accounts," Ashford said without looking up from his phone. "You clear everything through her before it moves." Griggs stared at Hazel with the expression of a man being asked to take directions from a parking meter. "She's an auditor. She's the reason we know about Taft." Ashford looked up, and Hazel had learned to read the cystific register of his voice well enough to know the conversation was over. She has my authorization to lock or release any account in the portfolio. She has access to the scheduling grid. If you have a problem with that, I'll hear it later. Griggs did not look happy, but he was clearly a man who understood the hierarchy of unhappiness, and he gave Hazel a short, evaluating look that contained, in its back layers, the very early stages of professional respect. Caruso's people are pulling back from the South Port, he said, directing it at Hazel now, which she registered as progress. But they've still got eyes on the Wacker facility. Hazel looked at her screen. There's a cash transfer scheduled for Thursday out of the Wacker facility account. 48,000 legitimate payroll. If Caruso's watching the facility, they'll see the transfer activity and assume it's operational. She looked at Griggs. Can you use that? Griggs looked at Ashford. Ashford said nothing, just watched. Griggs looked back at Hazel. Might be able to, he said slowly. Then make sure the transfer runs on schedule and very visibly, and put your people on the adjacent building 2 hours before it posts. She turned back to the screen. If they're watching the money, we know exactly where they'll be looking. There was a beat of silence in the penthouse. Then Griggs said, to no one in particular, "Ha." The Caruso problem was contained by Thursday evening. It was not over. These things were never over. Hazel had come to understand. They just cycled down to a manageable level. But the immediate pressure had been relieved, the accounts were clean, and Taft's assistant was in a location she chose not to think too hard about. Ashford's fever had broken on Wednesday morning. By Thursday, he was moving without favoring his left side, which she suspected meant he was hiding it, but she chose her battles. On Thursday evening, he came to the dining table and set down 2 cups of coffee, made correctly from the complicated machine, and sat across from her. They drank in silence for a while. "You should know," Hazel said, not looking up from her screen, "that I've been doing this long enough to know what happens to people who know as much as I know. I know what you think happens. Do you? You think I'm going to make you disappear once the Caruso situation settles?" He said it with the same flatness he used for everything, but she'd learned to look past the flatness now. "I'm telling you that's not what I'm planning." "Then what are you planning?" He was quiet for a moment. The city was dark beyond the glass, the skyline broken into its pieces of light. "I'm planning to offer you a position," he said, "a real one, not as an auditor, as the person who actually runs the financial architecture of this organization. Both sides of it," he looked at her, "with appropriate compensation and the kind of security arrangement that means no one comes near you without going through me first." Hazel considered this. She thought about the Gary apartment. She thought about 8 years of walking into rooms where she was the least important person. She thought about the specific look on Ashford's face when she had turned away from the open elevator and come back. The look that was not manipulation, not gratitude, but something rarer and harder to name. Recognition. The look of someone who had just understood, for possibly the first time, that he had been running his operation with a critical gap in the infrastructure and had only just found the piece that filled it. "I have conditions," she said. His mouth moved. It was the most complete version of the almost smile she'd seen from him. "I expected that. The Meridian fraud. I want the full recovery documented and returned to the operating accounts within 60 days. The ghost transactions get corrected retroactively." She looked at him. "I'm not running books that don't balance. If I'm in, it balances." "Done. And I want a real desk, not this table." She looked at the dining surface she had colonized for 5 days. "A real desk, a second monitor, and coffee that doesn't require a 14-step tutorial." Ashford looked at the handwritten card, still taped to the inside of the cabinet door. Something crossed his face that she would, later, understand had been the exact moment his armor developed its first structural crack, not from violence, not from loss, but from someone making a completely ordinary, human request and meaning it without any angle behind it. "Done," he said again, and then quieter, "Hazel." It was the first time he had used her name, just the first name, without anything else around it. She looked at him. He was looking back at her with the same direct, stripped-down attention he gave to things that actually mattered to him. "Why did you stay?" he asked. "The elevator Wednesday night. The code was right there." Hazel wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. She thought about the honest answer, which was complex and true, and had to do with the specific gravity of being needed in a way that was real, not because she was useful, not because she was convenient, but because she was the only person who could see the whole picture and had the particular kind of stubbornness to stay in the room with it. She thought about the simpler version, which was also true. "Because the books weren't balanced yet," she said. Ashford looked at her for a long time. "They won't be," he said, "not for a while. This is a long project." "I know," she picked up her pen. "That's why I'm staying." The city spread out below them, 40 floors of glass and steel between them, and everything that wanted to get in. Hazel opened the next file. Ashford picked up his phone. They got back to work. And somewhere in the accounting of what she had lost and what she had found, the number came out even.